Okay, take 2 of this video. These last 3, as I said in the last video, are going to be all kind of process skills to learn. We will go over these more in class, and I'm going to kind of re-explain it as well. I just want to briefly expose you to it in advance. So we're going to be talking about pedigrees in this video. A pedigree is essentially a family tree that shows how genes or alleles are passed down the generations. This slide basically explains the basic setup of a pedigree. So circles are always going to be females, squares are going to be males. The Roman numerals tell you the generation, and then the digit tells you what number individual within that generation you are. If your shape is colored in, that means you're affected by the trait. If you're not colored in, you don't have the trait. Then we have these founding parents, are the very first parents, and the founding family is the first parents and their actual offspring. Within these, if they are connected by a horizontal line, then that means they've mated and had children. And if there's a vertical line, that means that the people below are kids of those people above, next parents to their children. So you need to know the basic setup for these. What are these used for? These are often used by genetic counselors to find, like, what is the probability that someone will have this trait, that if you have kids that they will have this trait. You can track kind of how diseases move through a population, grow and disappear, things like that. What we're going to be using them for is to determine if disease alleles are dominant or recessive and autosomal or sex-linked, so if they're on the X chromosome or not. We have some general assumptions that will always hold true with these. First is that the trait is controlled by a single gene with only 2 alleles. Second, of those 2 alleles, one is completely dominant, the other is completely recessive, so essentially Mendelian inheritance. And then last, we assume the gene is not on the Y chromosome. It could be on the X chromosome, though. However, genes being on the Y, there's very few genes on the Y chromosome. We're just going to assume that essentially there's nothing. And we're going to have 5 clues that we use to kind of try and solve this whole thing out. So the first clue is that an unaffected individual, so if they do not have the disease, that means they do not have any alleles of a dominant trait. Because if the trait were dominant and they had an allele of it, that means they would have the disease. So if they're unaffected, that means they do not have any alleles of a dominant trait. Second, any individual marrying into the family is assumed to have no disease alleles. So if we quickly go back to the last slide, these 2 individuals in generation 3 and generation 2, neither of them have the trait, and we will assume that they don't even have an allele for the trait. So any disease allele would have had to come from within the family. Third, if you are unaffected, you could be a carrier of a recessive trait. Just means that your other copy is the good one. Fourth, if a trait is X-linked, then a single recessive allele is enough for a male to have that trait. This is because males only have 1 X chromosome, normally. So they don't really have dominant and recessive traits if they're on the X chromosome for males. They just have traits, because whatever's there is what's going to be expressed. So single recessive allele is enough. This is why men have much more color blindness than women, for example. And then lastly, a father transmits his allele of X-linked genes to his daughters, but not his sons. It's because the father has the ability the father determines the sex of the offspring. The father has not the option, but the ability to give either an X or a Y chromosome to his children. Women only have the ability to give an X chromosome. So with a father, he will always give his X chromosome to his daughters. He will always give his Y chromosome to his sons. So let's look at some common inheritance patterns, and then we'll do a practice and we'll be done. Recessive inheritance patterns. The disease has to be recessive if an individual has 2 unaffected parents. So if you have an affected child with unaffected parents, it's recessive. Might be autosomal, might be X-linked. We haven't determined that yet. But that's 1/2 of the equation down. So conversely, the disease has to be dominant if every affected child of a non-founding parent has an affected parent. Meaning they have the disease they have at least one disease-causing allele. That means one of their parents at least has to have a disease-causing allele, meaning they would have the disease themselves because it's dominant in this scenario. Next is X-linked versus autosomal. So we can determine recessive versus dominant by looking at, do I have a set of unaffected parents having a kid with the trait? So yes, we do. So how do we tell if it is X-linked or not? The general key, or at least a pattern to look for, is you'll see many more boys having the trait than girls. Meaning that many more boys will have the trait than girls, so you'll just see a lot more squares colored in than circles. They tend to make this pretty obvious. It's not like 5 boys to 4 girls. It's usually something like you see here, where it's 5 to 3, if we don't count the founding parents, because we kind of shouldn't. It's 5 to 2. So way more boys than girls having it. But that's not really a hard rule to follow. What we can look at is we kind of want to look at the boys and the fathers. So if we look at the parent generation here, the father does not have the trait. So we're going to assume it is X-linked recessive. This is generally how you go about solving these, is you make an assumption of what they are, and you try to disprove that with the data in your pedigree. So individual 2 here, if this is X-linked recessive, individual 2 has a good X chromosome, meaning all of their children will have at least one good chromosome. The mother has 2 bad chromosomes if it's X-linked recessive, meaning all of her children are going to have at least one bad chromosome for this trait. It also means that all of her sons will have the trait. No matter what, if it's X-linked recessive or X-linked dominant, all of her sons will have the trait because she has 2 of the disease-causing alleles. They're recessive, but when she passes them to her sons, that's the only copy they get. So they will always have the trait. Her sons always have the trait. The father passes on a good X chromosome to the daughters, so they're safe because it's a recessive trait. So they don't have the disease, but the sons have 1X from the mother, which is bad. They get their Y chromosome from the father, which doesn't have an effect here. And so all the boys have the trait, but none of the girls. So you want to be looking at patterns like that. Additionally, we can reinforce that by saying, okay, if we look at the children of these parents, if it's X-linked recessive, they should all have the disease, and they all do. You can disprove this X-linked dominant theory by looking at individuals 3 and 4 having a child with the trait. So you kind of have to look at it as, I'm going to prove if it is dominant or recessive, and then you have to prove, is it X-linked or autosomal. And again, make a choice. Say it's X-linked recessive, try and disprove that or prove it. But you kind of have to make a guess and check and see how it goes. I talked about color blindness already, but there are other types of sex-linked genes, including a couple of Y-linked genes, which are just fun to talk about. So X-linked genes, color blindness being the big one. Another one is hemophilia, which affects your ability of blood to clot. It's known as a royal disease. It is carried on the X chromosome and is very prominent in the royal families of Europe. Last is the fur color in cats. If you've seen a tortoiseshell cat, they have different color fur in kind of a patchy pattern, and that is because the color for their fur is on the X chromosome. They have 2 copies. All tortoiseshell cats are girls. And you can basically see where on their body each X chromosome is activated based on what color fur they have. The Y-linked ones, the one that people know, male pattern baldness, passes through the guy side of the family. And then the porcupine man, you essentially grow a bunch of like bristles on your skin instead of hair, like needles like a porcupine. So there's genes out there, there's traits, but not super, super common outside of color blindness, and obviously fur color in cats. Some other random cool stuff, as I was talking about with the cat fur color before, there's a process in female mammals called X inactivation, and randomly at some point in your early development, you silence one of your two X chromosomes in each of those cells. As they divide, it basically results in this patchy system where in some cells you have, for example, the black fur gene activated, and in others you have the orange fur gene activated. But it's kind of just completely random which one will be active where. And there are some other sex determination systems as well. Us humans have the XY system. Double X is female, XY is male. Grasshoppers operate on an X0 system. So if you have two X chromosomes, you're female. If you have one X chromosome, you're male. The birds and some reptiles operate on a ZW system, which is essentially the human XY system, but reversed, where females are heterozygous for the sex chromosome and males are homozygous. And then last, we have the haplodiploid system, one of my favorites. This is seen in bees, where if you are diploid, you're female, and if you're haploid, you're male. So all male bees have half the genetic info and are kind of worthless, except for helping out in the hive and helping the queen reproduce. So let's take a look at a quick practice, and then we will do more in class, and I'll talk about this more in class. So, based on the inheritance pattern shown in Figure 1, which of the following best predicts the nature of the original mutation? So, is it recessive? Is it dominant? Is it X-linked? Is it not? Okay, let's take a look. First thing I notice is that this person, this male cat, has two partners. Interesting. But more interestingly is that I have two unaffected parents with affected children. That means right away it has to be recessive, right? Because there's no other way for that to happen. Unaffected parents with affected children indicates a recessive mutation. So we now need to decide, is it X-linked or is it autosomal, aka onosomatic chromosome? The main thing to look at here, we can look at the parents we just did to determine that it's recessive. So if it's recessive, then this father, if it were X-linked, would essentially have to have the trait because a female and a male child both have it. So this female, because we know it's recessive, has to have two copies of the disease trait, meaning the male and the female here each have one copy, but don't have the trait themselves, meaning it has to be a recessive mutation on a somatic chromosome. You can look at it again with these parents here. If it were on the X chromosome, then by default, again, if this person were to have it, it's recessive, it's on the X chromosome, that means the father would have had to have given them a disease-causing X allele, meaning they would have had to have had the trait themselves. So again, can't be X-linked, has to be somatic and recessive. That is it for this one. Pedigree analysis can be tricky. Hang in there. Ask me questions. If you have any, write them down, and please bring them to me in class to ask, because pedigrees will show up on your unit exam and on the AP exam. Next time we get to go into chi-square analysis, which is even less fun. Woohoo! Bye. Oh no, I didn't do my now bye. This is too long. Sorry.